Hello, I'm Stephen Jedgetts. The Quad is a strategic dialogue between Australia, India, Japan and the United States. Now, yesterday, the leaders of the four countries met in Tokyo. It's the fourth time they've gathered in the last 2 years, and it underscores the growing importance of the Quad, which previously languished for years. In 2017, it was revived by the then US President Donald Trump, partly in a bid to take on China in its own backyard. And the steady decline in each Quad nation's bilateral ties with China since then has also given the Quad new importance and, importantly, new momentum. And as the dust settles from the meeting, new reports are surfacing that China is seeking a region-wide deal with more than a dozen Pacific Island countries. Now, East Asia correspondent Bill Birtles joins me now live from the Taiwanese capital to discuss this. Bill, now Reuters is reporting that China wants to sign a security, cyber and also a trade agreement with no fewer than 10 Pacific Island countries. What do we know so far about this proposal?
Yeah, Stephen, according to the report, this deal would be even more comprehensive and broad than the security pact that Beijing signed with the Solomon Islands. It would reportedly involve cooperation on policing, on security, on cyber security. Now, with policing, according to the reported details, that could involve Chinese police training for South Pacific nations. Of course, the Chinese police are not without controversy given their role in the repression in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, but also, too, the focus on some sort of cyber cooperation probably alludes to the role of Huawei in the South Pacific, the Chinese telecommunications company which Australia and the US has tried very hard to thwart when it comes to providing South Pacific nations with things like undersea cables. So at the moment, Stephen, these are just details that haven't been confirmed by the Chinese side, but obviously it's got everyone's attention.
Yeah, no, of course it has. And how anxious do you think that this would make Western officials? And also, how likely do you think it is that this agreement might go ahead?
Well, in general, I think there's been some expectation that when Wang Yi visits the region, he would push for similar deals to the ones that has already been signed in Honiara. That's what's been reported, that China was seeking cooperation on security with a couple of other countries, but at least 10. That really is ambitious. Surprisingly, though, the ABC has heard from some officials in the US and Australia who actually are not as concerned about this as you might think, because they believe this is a very ambitious play by Beijing and that it is going to get quite a bit of pushback in the South Pacific. In fact, according to the Reuters report, the president of the Federation of Micronesia is trying to persuade other South Pacific nations not to sign this because, in his words, it's predetermined by Beijing, it's being forced upon Pacific nations, and it will lead to a new Cold War in the region. Now, this afternoon, a Chinese government spokesman in Beijing rejected that these sorts of initiatives by the Chinese side is leading to a new form of Cold War in the South Pacific.
All right, thanks, Bill. And we will cross to Beijing later in the show to get the latest on that proposed agreement. Now, the end of the Quad meeting in Japan has been marked by a joint China-Russia Air Force drill near Japan's airspace, as well as a North Korean ballistic missile test. The new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, claims that his visit to Tokyo sends a clear message about Australia's commitment to its friends and to its allies. Hitting the ground running. The new Prime Minister has met more world leaders than he's spent full days in office.
I will always act with integrity. I'll always act with honesty in my dealings with other leaders.
And Anthony Albanese left Tokyo confident he'd reassured democratic partners Australia will stand firm on China.
The Quad Leaders Summit represents our common purpose in support of democracy, in support of peace and security in the region. China
has got the message and sent one of its own. Chinese and Russian warplanes conducting joint exercises near Japan, while Quad leaders were meeting, forcing Japan to scramble fighter jets.
There was no violation of the airspace of foreign states. The joint patrol is a planned event.
Mr Albanese will soon get another reminder of Beijing's burgeoning power closer to home. China's foreign minister will tomorrow begin a 10-day visit to no fewer than 8 Pacific Island countries.
The coming visit by Foreign Minister Wang Yi will further boost the political trust between China and the countries.
The first stop, Solomon Islands, which recently signed a security pact with China. Canberra fears other Pacific countries might do the same. The new Labor government hopes its more ambitious climate policy will bolster Australia's influence in the region.
Look, after a lost decade, we've got a lot of work to do to regain Australia's position as the partner of choice in the Pacific, in a region that's less secure and more contested. But that work starts now.
Now, North Asia correspondent James Oaten joins me now from Tokyo. James, what were some of the main outcomes of this Quad meeting and what has the response been like from other countries in the region?
Well, good evening, Stephen. The Quad ended its summit yesterday with the usual statement you hear so much, that the leaders are striving for a free and open Indo-Pacific. That phrase really is the founding principle of the Quad. And they all agreed that there should be no country that is, quote, trying to unilaterally change the status quo. Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, he, as the host nation, did get to give a summary of the Quad Leaders Summit, and he made a few pointed remarks at a few countries. First of all, Russia. He expressed concern and said Quad leaders were concerned about the war in Ukraine. Secondly, North Korea. They've very heavily criticised North Korea over their many rocket launches this year and said that they're a destabilising force in the region. And then China. Fumio Kishida said that all leaders expressed grave concern over China's actions in the East and South China Sea. Now, it seems those three countries aren't too pleased with the Quad. Last night, Russian and Chinese bombers did conduct military drills and they started to make their way towards Japan. Now, they didn't encroach Japanese airspace and they didn't breach the territory there, but Japan has clearly seen this type of action as antagonistic, and they did respond and get their fighter jets up in the air to make sure there wasn't any encroachment on their territory. Then, of course, this morning, North Korea launched 3 ballistic missiles. One of them is suspected to be an intercontinental ballistic missile. Now, there was expectation North Korea could do something like this. Certainly the US had talked about them launching a missile to time when Joe Biden was in the region. He had left Japan a few hours before the missile launches, but worth noting, Anthony Albanese was still in Japan. The concern now is what will North Korea do next, and it seems they are planning a nuclear test. All this activity from Russia, from China, and from certainly North Korea is likely to only harden the Quad's resolve.
That's right. Now, the Quad's also struggled to reach a consensus when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Did they come any closer this time around?
Well, certainly there was mention that there was concern about the situation in Ukraine. And one of the issues is that India is out of lockstep with Japan, Australia and the United States. Those 3 countries have been very critical of Russia. They've imposed sanctions on Russia and provided support to Ukraine. India hasn't. Now, they have repeatedly expressed concern over the broader situation, but they never specifically criticised Russia. And that's because they've got a long history of friendship with Russia and they're very heavily involved with Russia for their own military hardware. So Fumio Kishida did predict there would be some questions on this. He said that India certainly has expressed concern. He made that point very early. But the questions were, does this weaken the Quad's unity? Well, Fumio Kishida said you can't have every country agree absolutely on every issue, but he said, given the statement they've made, clearly the Quad nations are more unified than ever.
All right, thanks, James. We really appreciate your time. And joining me now to discuss the Quad is Susanna Patton, who's a research fellow and project director in the Power and Diplomacy program at the Lowy Institute. We've also got Kate Clayton, an international relations academic at La Trobe University. Her research areas include Australia, China, the Pacific and the United States. And Gorana Gurgic, who's a senior lecturer at the United States Studies Centre at Sydney University. All thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Look, I might start first of all with you, Susanna, if that's all right. Recently, Quad leaders have been absolutely adamant that the grouping is not about containing China, but it's all about providing so-called public goods to the region. Do you think that that's a plausible account of what the Quad is, and do you think that Beijing buys it?
No, I mean, I think the group is clearly about, say, containing China. They might say constraining instead of containing, or managing the influence of China, but clearly China is the reason why the four countries are meeting. And I think the effort to provide public goods like vaccines is really about making the Quad appear more acceptable to other countries in the region. But ultimately, I don't think that that is fooling anyone. We know why the Quad exists, and it's about managing China's growing regional influence.
Kate, what do you think? Obviously, Beijing is very hostile, openly hostile towards the Quad. They always have been, and they always presumably will be. But do you feel like there's anything that the Quad can do or say to change Beijing's mind on this front, or are they just going to see it for what it is?
I don't think there's anything that the Quad states can do to change China's minds, and I don't necessarily think that that's the function of the Quad. I think the function of the Quad is to serve the Indo-Pacific, to keep it free, open, resilient, and most recently, economically secure as well. So there's other functions of the Quad outside of this geopolitical transition. Whilst that's the kind of main source of the Quad, it does have these other aspects of it, such as climate change, cyber, and space, that are key to the region and stability.
Gorana, what do you think? Obviously, we've had some pretty impressive announcements from the Quad, but delivery has been a bit uneven at times. How do you judge its record so far in areas like vaccine delivery and the like?
Well, certainly we've seen that the sort of buzz around the kind of unilateral forms of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific has ramped up, and increasingly so. So in terms of responses to crisis, obviously this was what propelled the creation of the Quad back in the aftermath of the 2004 tsunami. But obviously in recent years, it was also being repurposed, or was aimed to serve as a vehicle to coordinate efforts and to try to get these countries cooperate on issues like the pandemic, or, as we've heard already, on now issues that are also these kind of problems without passports, like climate change. But I would say with the most recent meeting that just ended, what was really interesting was the way that the Biden administration has used this opportunity not just to conspicuously not mention China, but very openly mention Russia, and to frame the whole point of this meeting in a way that fits the Biden agenda of the kind of democracy summit, of basically this fight and struggle against autocracies. And again, even though Russia wasn't explicitly mentioned in the final statement of the summit, it was very clear that the administration is trying to use these partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, as well as obviously where it's much closer in the transatlantic space, to coordinate efforts and cooperation on Russia and on halting the war in Ukraine.
And just on that, Gorana, I mean, obviously India remains to some extent poles apart from the other three Quad members when it comes to Ukraine. But Australian officials, in any case, seem to think that they might be able to use the Quad to nudge India gently. The fact that there's been nothing even approaching consensus inside the Quad, is that a sign of weakness, or is it actually a sign of strength that the Quad is big enough to contain these disagreements and to provide a really useful space for dialogue and discussion?
it could be a bit of column A and column B in this case. Obviously, we need to understand domestic politics and calculations, as well as the kind of traditional sort of foreign policy standpoints on part of the different Quad members. And we can't kind of push aside the fact that India has for so long maintained this kind of non-aligned status and foreign policy. So certainly also if we think about the way that it procures everything from weapons to commodities, it is still very much dependent on Russia. And obviously the fact that it chose not to criticize Russia in the aftermath of invasion of Ukraine and the ensuing war is a product of those factors. But again, the fact that the leaders are meeting so often and that there are all these announcements that are coming out, that there are some signs and products actually of the cooperation yielding some outputs really is really a testament to the fact that there is a lot more of strategic alignment when it comes to what they perceive is the greatest strategic threat.
Susanna, I might come back to you now. Now, as you know, Southeast Asian countries, as well as Pacific Island countries, have regarded the Quad quite carefully. And we saw this time around, again, a very deliberate attempt by all leaders to sort of reference the fact that they saw Southeast Asia as central to the region, to pay tribute to the importance of the Pacific Island states. Do you think that bodies like ASEAN take that seriously, or do they take it with a grain of salt? How do they regard the Quad these days? Are they still a little bit cautious, or is there a bit of an evolution to their thinking now?
I think there is some evolution, but they're still cautious. And, there are a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, they see that the Quad could supplant their own meetings and institutions as being the most important annual regional gatherings. And we can see that that is already happening to some extent. That concern can possibly be managed by the Quad partners. If they play things well and they work effectively through ASEAN, then things can be managed. But when it comes to their broader concern, which is really that the Quad is ratcheting up regional tensions and adding to geopolitical contestation, that's a very hard concern for the Quad partners to manage, because it goes to the fact that Southeast Asian countries and, like you say, Pacific countries do have fundamentally different conceptions of what security is and how you maintain it.
Yeah. What do you think on that front, Kate? Do you feel like there's just a yawning gap between that conceptualisation of security between Quad nations in particular and countries, for example, in the Pacific? And how can that gap be bridged, or is it just impossible to really do that?
I think in regards to conceptions of security, the Quad does have quite an expanded conception of security. So we saw in the most recent meeting these past few days that it takes into account climate security, economic security, financial as well as maritime security, and these are all core concepts to what Pacific nations identify as their security, as we saw in the Bowie Declaration in 2019. So I think the Quad concept of security, perhaps more than the states individually in terms of how they view their military resources and geopolitical competition, has quite an expanded concept of security. As was mentioned earlier, their formation at the 2004 tsunami really shows this humanitarian and disaster resilience core at the Quad. And I think that's at the real strengths of the Quad in the region that's going to be grappling with the outcomes of climate change. And I think that's one reason why the Quad is really helpful for Pacific nations in its ability to draw capacity and infrastructure to help with climate adaptation and mitigation.
Gorana, what do you think? Where do you think the Quad might go next, or what areas might it focus on? Obviously, it's already got a very full dance card, particularly when it comes to things like the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. But where else might it look? What other areas might it turn its gaze towards?
Well, we've seen some announcements now about stepped up cooperation when it comes to maritime surveillance, for instance, or greater coordination and pooling of resources when it comes to infrastructure diplomacy. We know that the latter has been really the space where a lot of the competition is basically taking place around, trying to find a platform to best respond to the Belt and Road Initiative initiatives. So whether it's through expanding efforts and building on the Blue Dot Network or the Build Back Better world agenda that the leaders of G7 have agreed on and similar. So those would be some of the more concrete issues, if you wish, in the space of the kind of geopolitics meets geoeconomics.
All right, and just finally, I might ask all three of you just for a very brief reflection. If there was some sort of rapprochement between China and one or more of the Quad's constituent members, perhaps India or even Japan, do you think the entire enterprise could come crashing down, or would it live on in a different fashion? Susanna, might get you quickly first and then briefly go to the others.
I think already the different Quad countries do have different approaches to China. I mean, we know that Japan has a diplomatic relationship with China, which continues in a very different way to the one that Australia has had. So I think absolutely there's room for flexibility, but the four countries are going to remain pretty much on the same page when it comes to the need to constrain China's influence.
All right, Kate, just if I can draw you, then quickly Garana after that.
I think seconding Susanna, I think that there's a lot of opportunity, regardless of the state's individual relations with China, to keep the Quad stable. I think it's vital to the security of the Indo-Pacific region and also as a tool for dialogue and infrastructure development as well in the region.
And I couldn't have put it better. I would just say that we have seen the paradigm shift from the China challenge to basically dealing with a changed China. So unless China changes, it will be very hard to see how the calculations on part of these states would change. But, strategies are dynamic and interactive. So let's leave it at that.
All right. Well, it's always good to leave a conversation in furious agreement. So I'll leave it there and say thanks very much to all three of you for joining the ABC tonight. We really appreciate your time.
Pleasure.
Cool. Thank you.
And as we discussed earlier, there are reports that China's seeking a sweeping police, free trade and cyber security agreement with 10 Pacific Island countries. Now, joining me now is Qin Duozhu, a political analyst and senior fellow at Pangol Institution. Sir, thank you very much for joining us. Have you seen these recent reports coming out from Reuters about this new sweeping apparent agreement that's being pursued by China? And do you think it's something that Pacific Island nations might pursue?
Yeah, it's really about the China's long-term obviously like the concept or the view of the global development. Chinese President Xi Jinping talked about the global development initiative to be accurate, along with the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's really, I think, one thing to emphasize from Chinese point of view is really about the development in different areas, mostly in economic sense, investment and trade, and of course, cooperation in other areas, including growingly, I would say, digital economy, cybersecurity, etc. But also, one thing probably to notice is that China is not strengthening military presence in other parts of the world or military cooperation with security cooperation is not the priority, I would say, for China to develop relations with other countries. In particular, to develop a new grouping, a new kind of a framework or targeting against a particular country or particular grouping of country. No, for China, because China has benefited greatly, or probably the country benefited the most from globalization. So China is actually the country which strongly supports the continuation of globalization of free trade, because simply it benefits China's development.
But if that's the case, sir, you only have to look at the agreement that's been struck between China and Solomon Islands, which is very much about policing and potentially even a military presence down the track. Now, obviously, these are different conceptions of security, but can you understand why some in Solomon Islands are bewildered by this turn of events and say they don't see any compelling reason for Chinese police, for example, to be brought into Solomon Islands? What's the rationale behind an agreement like that?
Yeah, good question, Stephen. A few years back, you would see there are Chinese policemen on the streets of Rome in Italy, and you will be surprised why there are Chinese policemen over there. And also, interestingly, in the Great Wall of China, into China, one of the well-known scenery spots, right? People will visit Beijing and Great Wall, and you do see sometimes like Italian police force over there. That's as like a part of the exchange program. That's basically done on the request of the Italian side because there were so many Chinese tourists, and there's sometimes small security issue. People probably their backpack or their pocket. There are pocket pickers. Sometimes they lost some small property, personal properties. But because of the language issue, there's a need, for the presence of Chinese policemen. That would be easier to be dealt with. That's a consideration. Like to provide more security for Chinese tourists over there. But in the area of the cooperation between China and the Solomon Islands, I think it's a bit different. But also, we need to probably keep in mind that it's a joint program. It's the outcome of cooperation between two countries. It's not like the Chinese side demand the Solomon Islands do this and that. It's obviously not the case. We can see from the strong defense from the Prime Minister of Solomon Islands, his words over there. At the same time,
I'm sorry to interrupt there, but can I just ask you very, very briefly? I mean, Rome is one thing, Honiara is another. Obviously, there's a long history of ethnic tensions involving both Chinese nationals and also Solomon Islands nationals of Chinese descent. Throwing Chinese police into that particular tinderbox could have unforeseen consequences. Would you agree? It's not really comparable to a policing agreement for tourists in somewhere like Rome.
Oh, it's different. In terms of security, remember, in this country, there's no military. So basically, the public security is completely in the hands of the police force. So you need to boost up your police force in terms of the equipment, in terms of the training. Basically, China is helping doing that, just like what Australia has been doing with this country. I understand the people will say, it's really why Australia sees it as like, oh, this is our backyard. So China should not have there's a certain limit for the presence of China. China is a global power. And look, your prime minister came to Tokyo and talk about joining the U.S., talk about basically containing China or, the containment, against China. Why does he flew thousands of miles away to join an event against China? Is this part of the world the backyard of Australia? That's simply, for us, for Chinese, it's hard to understand what's going on. This is the 21st century. It's the globalized world. Solomon Islands is a sovereign nation. Whatever they want to do with China, with Australia, with the U.S., it's up to them. It's that simple.
All right. Chin Duo, thank you very much for joining the ABC. We appreciate your time. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the Australian Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, is preparing to visit Fiji tomorrow, just as the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, embarks on an 8-nation Pacific tour. And his first stop is the Pacific island nation of the Solomon Islands. And Solomon Islands journalist Dorothy Wickham joins us now from the capital, Honiara. Thanks for joining us, Dorothy. Now, I know you've been involved in this. The Chinese government, I understand, has essentially prevented Solomon Islands journalists from asking Wang Yi a question, and the last I heard was that resulted in a media walkout, essentially. Is that still the case? Is the media effectively, from Solomon Islands anyway, going to boycott tomorrow's visit?
Yes, the Media Association President, Georgina Kekea, issued the boycott notice to all members of MASI to stand in solidarity on the principle that yes, there's a press conference being held. They're limiting the numbers, and they're also limiting the questions. That's what we're standing on.
All right. And just briefly, Dorothy, can I also ask you, how do you think ordinary people in Solomon Islands regard this trip, and what's their attitude towards Manasseh Sogavare's increasing closeness? That's the Prime Minister of Solomon Islands, his increasing closeness to China.
Well, as you know, when the Security Pact was announced, that caused a big uproar. And then over the last few weeks, it sort of died down, and because the media has not been able to even talk about this security pact, because we have no details, because nobody's actually sat down and explained what this is all about, because it's not only the security pact that's going to be signed, it's all these other MOUs that are being lined up to sign tomorrow.
What do you make of Australia's role here? The opposition leader has been berating Australia, saying that it didn't move quickly enough to try and head this off. Do you think those criticisms are fair? Is it your sense that Australia was essentially caught napping here?
I think Scott Morrison dropped the ball, especially when he did not cooperate with the Pacific Island countries in the last forum on climate change. And I think that was a bit of a turnaround for a lot of our leaders, because they were not happy about that. Can't talk development in the Pacific without climate change. How can we develop when we've been affected by climate change? And I think Australia needs to remember that.
Do you feel like the situation right now with the current political calculus means that Mr. Sogavare will continue to simply drift closer to China? And what does civil society in Honiara make of this?
I think everybody's spoken out about it over the last 3-4 weeks now, since this whole uproar about the security pact came about. And I think the government is set on its agenda, that it's going to go through with this. I think a lot of Somalilanders agree that China will bring the country some good in terms of infrastructure and maybe trade. But what everybody's complaining about is our government not opening up and explaining to the people. These are the people's natural resources, their land, their sea. They need to be told and informed about what's going on.
And finally, Dorothy, do you have any hope whatsoever that the Chinese authorities and the local government might give way, or do you think it's likely the press will be locked out tomorrow?
I think they're going to stand on the position they've taken, and I think they're also worried too, since all these pictures were released in the foreign media recently about human rights abuses in China. So I think that could be one reason why they've suddenly locked down on us. But we are foremost Somalilanders, and we want to know about what's happening in our country. And
of course, I
Right
understand, yes. No, I think that's good. I'm sorry, Dorothy Wickham, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. And that is the program. I'm Stephen Jedgetts. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.